In the Pacific War, a radio message could be as dangerous as artillery. A position might change in minutes. A supply route might be exposed. A landing plan could depend on a sentence getting from one unit to another before an enemy listener understood it. The equipment was often small enough to carry through mud and brush: a field radio, a headset, a notebook, a hand on a dial. But the useful part of the system was not the machine. It was the trained person speaking into it. In 1943, a photograph now held by the National Archives showed two Navajo Marines, Henry Bake Jr. and George Kirk, operating a portable radio in a jungle clearing behind the front lines. The image is quiet. It does not show the message they carried, and it does not need to. Their work was to send information quickly enough to matter and securely enough that an intercepted transmission would not hand it to the enemy. That work became known to the public as the story of the Navajo code talkers. It is often told with a single, simple line: the Marines used Navajo because no one could understand it. That line contains part of the truth, but it leaves out the part that explains why the system worked under pressure. The men were not merely speaking ordinary dîner bizarre over the radio. They were operating a deliberately built military code, one created by Navajo recruits and refined for the demands of war. This is the question behind the familiar legend. How did a group of dîner men turn a language into a fast, memorized communications system for the Marine Corps? And what can the surviving records actually tell us about the work they did? The answer begins with a military problem, not with a myth. By the early years of World War II, commanders needed communications that could move faster than many conventional encryption methods. A message had to be encoded, transmitted, received, decoded, and acted upon. Delay was not a small inconvenience. On an island battlefield, delay could mean a unit advancing without the information another unit had already learned. In early 1942, Philip Johnston, a World War I veteran who had grown up near the Navajo Nation as the son of a missionary, proposed using Navajo speakers for marine communications. The Navy's historical account says he demonstrated the idea under simulated combat conditions. According to that account, Navajo speakers could encode, transmit, and decode a 3-line English message in about 20 seconds, far quicker than the mechanical systems then available for the comparison. The demonstration did not mean that the Marine Corps simply discovered a ready-made code hidden inside the language. It meant that the Corps saw the possibility of building one. Navajo was known to relatively few outsiders, but a battlefield system also needed shared rules. It needed a way to express military terms that did not already exist in ordinary conversation. It needed alternatives for repeated letters. It needed every operator to memorize the same system and use it accurately while tired, frightened, wet, or under fire. On May 5, 1942, the first 29 Navajo recruits arrived at the Marine Corps Recruit Depot in San Diego for basic training. The number matters, but not because it turns them into a legend frozen in a photograph. It matters because this first group became the workshop for the code. After basic training, National Archives records placed them at Camp Elliott, where they received instruction in radio operation and message transmission. There, with communications personnel, they began building a vocabulary that could carry military information without saying the English terms directly. That is why the Code Talker's story is not simply a story about secrecy. It is a story about intellectual labor performed in uniform. The famous radio transmission was the visible end of a much longer chain. Enlistment, boot camp, language knowledge, technical training, code design, memorization, and a dangerous journey into a Pacific war zone. The next piece of the record is a small printed dictionary. It reveals how the system moved beyond the broad claim that Navajo was difficult for outsiders to understand and became a practical code that could be used at speed. The surviving Navajo Code Talker's Dictionary does not look like a dramatic battlefield artifact. It looks like what it was, a working tool. The Navy's online copy is a revised version dated June 15, 1945, and later declassified. On its pages are letter assignments, military vocabulary, and English glosses. Seen today, it makes one fact unmistakable. The code was not plain Navajo conversation. It was a second layer of shared meaning. Suppose an operator needed to send an English word that was not included in the prepared military vocabulary. He could spell it with a coded alphabet. The word for ant, for example, could stand for the letter A. But even this was not a one-word-per-letter shortcut. The dictionary provided more than one choice for many letters. That mattered because repetition could create a pattern for an interceptor to study. The National Archives explains that the original alphabet was expanded with alternatives for commonly repeated letters, while the vocabulary itself grew beyond its initial form. That sequence corrects a common misunderstanding. Fluency in Navajo alone did not make someone a Navajo code talker. The operator also needed the military codebook, the training, and the practiced ability to move between English military language and a memorized set of Navajo words under severe time constraints. National Archives material makes the point plainly. An interceptor would have needed both knowledge of the language and knowledge of the code. The first version contained 211 terms, according to the enlistment records and teaching material preserved by the National Archives. It was later expanded. Numbers in wartime records can vary by edition and date, but the basic pattern is clear. The code did not remain fixed. It developed as the program developed. That is one reason it is better understood as a communications system than as a language trick. The program expanded rapidly. A 1942 memorandum in the National Archives records that more Navajo recruits were recommended after the initial group demonstrated the system's value. By the end of the war, official accounts commonly place the number trained as code talkers at more than 400. The Navy fact sheet gives a range of roughly 375 to 420, while also noting that about 540 Navajo men served as Marines in total. The difference is not a mystery. It reflects the difference between counting all Navajo Marines and counting only those trained as code talkers, as well as the limits of wartime records. The scale is important because it changes how we picture the program. It was not 29 men speaking from a single command post for 3 years. Code talkers served with Marine units across the Pacific. The Navy's history lists Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and other operations. The National Park Service notes their service at Guam and Peleliu, and records that Marine reports considered them indispensable for the rapid transmission of classified information during those operations. Indispensable is a strong word, and it comes from a wartime report rather than from a modern slogan, but it should still be read carefully. It does not mean the code talkers alone decided a battle. No single communications method can explain an entire campaign made up of thousands of people, ships, aircraft, supplies, and decisions. It means something more exact. Commanders regarded fast, secure communications as necessary to the operations they were trying to conduct, and code talkers were an essential part of that communications work. The code's speed came from training. A mechanical system could be secure, but slow. Ordinary speech could be quick, but exposed. The code talkers had to create another path, a system that could be memorized, spoken, heard through imperfect equipment, and reconstructed quickly by a partner who knew the same entries. That is the technical heart of the story. But a codebook, even a good one, does not tell us what it felt like to use a radio when terrain, weather, and combat turned every connection into a problem. For that, the record moves from the dictionary to the Pacific itself. The Pacific Theater was not a clean map of arrows. It was a chain of islands, reefs, beaches, ridges, jungle clearings, ships, and temporary command posts separated by water and weather. A message could begin at a forward position, travel by radio or field telephone, and reach a command post where its meaning had to be understood before the situation changed again. That setting explains why the code talker's work cannot be reduced to a single claim about an unbreakable language. A secure message that arrives too late is no longer useful. A fast message that can be understood by an enemy is dangerous. The Marine Corps needed both speed and security, and it needed operators who could keep working when the conditions were least favorable. The Navy's World War II fact sheet says Navajo code talkers took part in every Marine assault in the Pacific from 1942 through 1945. They served in all 6 Marine divisions, Marine Raider battalions, and Marine parachute units. The National Park Service identifies Guam and Peleliu as operations in which reports described their service as indispensable for rapidly moving classified material. Those are large statements, but the work itself happened in small actions. Listening through a headset, repeating a message precisely, checking a word, carrying equipment, moving to the next position, and beginning again. Consider what had to happen when an English command contained a place name, a unit designation, or a word not listed as a full vocabulary item. The sender could not simply improvise. He had to use the coded alphabet and choose the proper terms. The receiver had to reverse the process without losing the order of the message. Both men had to keep the code in memory. The dictionary was not meant to be opened casually while a message waited. The Navy's account says the code words had to be memorized during training. At Iwo Jima, one often repeated quotation has helped shape public memory. Major Howard Connor, the 5th Marine Division signal officer, later said, "Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima." The Navy fact sheet reports that Connor had 6 code talkers working around the clock during the first 2 days, and that they sent and received more than 800 messages without error. The quote deserves care. It is an officer's retrospective judgment, not a mathematical proof that 6 men alone determined the battle. Iwo Jima was fought by a vast force and at a terrible human cost. But the specific figure gives the judgment a concrete basis, a high volume of messages moving without error during a period when communication was central to coordination. The historical value of the statement is not that it turns code talkers into solitary heroes. It shows how a signal officer understood the importance of their work in the middle of a complicated operation. There is another reason to resist turning the story into a simple tale of a magical code. The Navy's own account says the code did not become secure merely because it used Navajo words. A listener who somehow knew Navajo still would have faced the military system layered on top of it. The original code talkers had assigned words for military concepts and created a spelling method for the rest. Security came from that combination, and from the fact that the system was held inside a trained group whose members were bound by military discipline. This was communication as teamwork. One operator could not create the network alone. The sender depended on a receiver. Both depended on the same training. They depended on technicians, radio equipment, commanders who understood the system, and other Marines moving information from one point to another. The code talker's achievement belongs to the men who built and used the code, but it also belongs in the larger history of wartime communications. The next question is harder because it concerns absence. If the code talkers were so valuable in wartime, why did so many Americans learn their names only decades later? The answer is not a hidden plot. It is written into the status of the code itself. When the war ended, the code did not immediately become a public story. The National Archives notes that code talkers returned home without parades or fanfare and were sworn to secrecy because the system remained classified. The code was not declassified until 1968. That long silence explains part of the gap between their wartime service and their later recognition. Secrecy made practical sense to the military. A communications method that had worked in war might still be considered useful in another conflict. But secrecy also shaped memory. Veterans could not freely explain the work they had done. Families and communities knew men had served, yet the full purpose of their service was not always something that could be discussed in public. A program built on spoken messages then became a history marked by years of official quiet. The silence is sometimes turned into a story of intentional erasure. The records support a more precise conclusion. Recognition was delayed in significant part because the code remained classified. That does not make the delay unimportant. It tells us why public memory formed unevenly. The people who had carried the work could not fully describe it, while the documentary evidence sat inside military files and archives. The surviving documents bring us back to the work. There is the enlistment memorandum, the revised dictionary, the field photographs, and the reports that describe service in specific operations. Together, they let us see the program in a clearer way. The Code Talkers did not carry an ancient secret into the war. They created and mastered a modern military system with the language they knew, adapting it to radios, field telephones, code books, and the vocabulary of a global conflict. That distinction matters for Diné history as well. Too many public retellings treat Navajo language as a mysterious object whose value appears only when the United States military needs it. The documented story is more human and more demanding. Diné speakers brought knowledge, skill, memory, and discipline to a system they helped build. The language was living knowledge, held by people, not a prop, a relic, or a password waiting to be discovered. The National Park Service says that the enemy never deciphered the code during World War II. This is the strongest supported version of the famous claim. It does not require exaggeration. It is enough to say that the Marine Corps deployed Navajo code talkers in the Pacific, that the code remained secure against enemy decipherment, and that official reports valued their speed in moving classified information. It is also important to say what this evidence does not establish. It does not prove that every transmission was perfect, or that the code alone won an island campaign. It does not tell us the private thoughts of every man who served. It does not authorize anyone to reduce a diverse Diné community to a wartime symbol. And it does not make the language itself a weapon detached from the people who spoke it. For the viewer, that kind of caution changes the story from a legend into an investigation. Instead of asking whether the Marines found a mystical language no one could defeat, we can ask better questions. What did the dictionary require a code talker to know? How fast could the system work under combat conditions? Which operations produced reports describing it as indispensable? Why did the veterans have to remain silent after returning home? The answers lead back to the same image from 1943. 2 Navajo Marines, a portable radio, and a clearing in dense jungle. The photograph does not capture the sound of the code. It captures the conditions under which the code had to function. There was no stage, no audience, and no guarantee that the next message would arrive cleanly. There was only a task that had to be done correctly. Before we return to that image for the final answer, there is one last correction to make. The most lasting legacy of the Code Talkers is not that their story became famous. It is that public recognition can now rest on records that show what their skill actually involved. The Navajo Code Talkers' story is often introduced with a puzzle. How could the enemy fail to break the code? The records answer that question in layers. First, the Marine Corps drew on a language that relatively few outsiders understood. Second, the first Navajo recruits and communications personnel developed a formal vocabulary and alphabet system for military use. Third, trained operators memorized that system and used it with radios and field telephones in the Pacific. Finally, the system moved messages at a speed commanders considered essential in combat operations. None of those layers is mystical. Every one of them required work. The Code Talkers Dictionary is especially revealing because it preserves the designed nature of the system. It shows an alphabet with alternate choices. It shows vocabulary adapted to military needs. It shows that the code was maintained as a practical instrument, revised as the war continued. In a conflict often remembered through ships, aircraft, and amphibious landings, the dictionary reminds us that a military operation could also depend on memory, hundreds of terms held accurately by a trained person under pressure. That is why the title, "The Language the Enemy Could Not Break," needs one final qualification. The Navy and National Park Service records say the enemy never deciphered the Navajo code used by the Marines. But the program's security did not rest on language alone. It rested on Diné language combined with a separate code system, specialized training, and the skill of the men who used it. Saying that clearly does not lessen their accomplishment. It lets us see it more fully. The other part of the answer is speed. The program was valuable because it did not ask operators to choose between safety and urgency. In the wartime demonstration described by the Navy, a 3-line message could be encoded, transmitted, and decoded in about 20 seconds. Later reports from Guam and Peleliu described code talkers as indispensable to rapid classified communication. At Iwo Jima, a signal officer remembered 6 code talkers sending and receiving more than 800 messages without error during the first 2 days. Those facts do not make the code talkers a shortcut for explaining the war. Battles were shaped by many forces, and the losses at places such as Iwo Jima cannot be turned into an uplifting anecdote. But the records establish something substantial. Within the vast machinery of the Pacific Campaign, Navajo Marines performed a communications role that their commanders considered indispensable. But recognition should not flatten the men into a single symbol. There were the original code makers, the later recruits, radio operators, messengers, and Marines assigned to units across the Pacific. There were people who had to learn the same entries, trust a voice through a headset, and repeat a message exactly. There were Diné families and communities to whom these men returned after the war. A documentary can describe the system. It cannot claim to contain all of those lives. If this story has a lesson, it is not that history hides its greatest answers inside a secret language. The surviving evidence points somewhere more concrete. Language is knowledge carried by people. Under the extraordinary pressure of war, Navajo Marines and their fellow communicators turned that knowledge into a precise, modern code. The value was not in mystery. It was in expertise. So return one last time to the archival photograph of Henry Bake Jr. and George Kirk in the jungle clearing. The radios look modest beside the scale of the war. The men look focused because they had to be. Between the sender and receiver was a system they had learned by heart. Between them and the enemy was a code the enemy never deciphered. And between the famous legend and the documented history is a truth that is more compelling than the legend. It worked because Diné men designed, memorized, and carried out an exacting task when it mattered. If you want to follow the evidence beyond this episode, look at the 1945 dictionary itself. It turns an abstract claim about an unbreakable code into a record of design, discipline, and language in action. That is where this story is strongest, not in a mystery left unsolved, but in a document that still shows how the work was done.